Predictions about the Arctic also pop up regularly in my channel fora, but all too often the experts in their field turn out to be Al Gore, who's not an expert and hasn't published a study on Arctic ice. Al Gore's claim is based on something a researcher called Wisław Maslowski said at a meeting of the American Geophysical Union in 2007, that the Arctic might be ice-free during the summer within 5 years. Nearly all the peer-reviewed studies at the time were predicting an ice-free summer Arctic decades ahead, around 2070. In fact, later measurements showed that the Arctic is melting much faster than predicted, so most recent studies have brought the date forward closer to the range of between 2040 and 2060.
Number 7, using computer models, research conclude that global warming would raise the average annual temperatures nationwide by 2 degrees by 2010, that according to the Associated Press in 1989.
According to Fox News, which compiled the list, AP got this from a study by the Atmospheric and Environmental Research Inc. But it doesn't say where the study was published, or from when this temperature rise is supposed to be measured, or what the margin of error is. It's impossible to compare this prediction if we don't know what it was predicting. In its rebuttal, Fox News cites global temperatures, but the study itself supposedly cited nationwide temperatures. But if Fox News wants to look at global temperatures, there's a much more famous prediction from that time that does that, and one that bloggers frequently cite as a failure. In 1988, James Hansen looked at forcing by carbon dioxide based on 3 possible scenarios, depending on what governments and industry decided to do in the next few decades. Scenario A showed what would happen to temperatures if no action was taken to curb CO2 emissions and there was exponential growth. In other words, the growth in CO2 concentration accelerated. Scenario B showed temperatures assuming some action was taken to curb CO2 emissions, and there was a linear rate of growth. And Scenario C showed temperatures assuming cuts in CO2 emissions. As it turned out, action was taken to curb CO2 emissions, thanks in large part to the Kyoto Protocol. So Scenario A was avoided. What the world ended up with was linear growth, Scenario B. This is what Hansen predicted would be the temperature rise. 30 years on, how does that compare with the actual temperature rise? Pretty much spot on. Hansen used a climate sensitivity of 4.2 degrees centigrade for his projection, whereas more recent research shows the sensitivity closer to 3 degrees centigrade. If 3 degrees is used, the projection is even more accurate. Now, of course, people who spend all their time in chat rooms and blogs hearing the mantra that the models are wrong are not going to accept this. I get it. You've seen graphs that show something completely different. So where did those come from? In 1998, a climatologist called Patrick Michaels told a House of Representatives committee that actual temperature measurements had failed to follow the projection made by Hansen 10 years earlier. As evidence, he showed Hansen's 3 different scenarios and compared them to actual temperatures. At least that's what he should have done. What he actually did was airbrush out the scenario that followed the real rise in CO2 concentration and only showed the projected temperature rise caused by accelerating CO2 emissions, a scenario that never happened. It's hard to dismiss this as a mistake, because Michaels is a qualified research climatologist and understands how projections work, and he knew what the measured rise in CO2 was. But I should mention that he was no longer a research climatologist when he testified. 4 years earlier, he had started a lobbying company, an advocacy company called New Hope Environmental Services. I can't tell you who funds him. I'll let Patrick Michaels tell you himself.
What I'm saying is that...
Is your research funded by these industries?
Not largely. The fact of the matter is...
Can I ask you what percentage of your work is funded by the petroleum industry?
I don't know. 40%? I don't know.
Okay.
There's nothing wrong with being an advocate for oil industry interests, and that shouldn't matter or make any difference, as long as his testimony to Congress in 1998 was scientifically accurate. Unfortunately, it wasn't. In fact, it was so misleading that it caused a senior spokesperson for the Libertarian Cato Institute to change his mind when he discovered the deception. The Cato Institute is a political organisation also lobbying against climate change. Patrick Michaels and Jerry Taylor were their most prominent spokesmen. Not being a scientist, Taylor simply repeated Michaels' claims that Hansen's forecasts were way off. After one particular TV interview where he gave the usual talking points, he describes what happened next. After we got done with the programme and were back in the green room getting the makeup off, Joe said to me, "Did you even read that testimony you've just talked about?" And when I told him it had been a while, he said, "I'm daring you to go back and double-check this." He told me that some of Hansen's projections were spot on. So I went back to my office and I reread Hansen's testimony, and Joe was correct. So then I talked to the climate skeptics who had made this argument to me, and it turns out they'd done so with full knowledge that they were being misleading. Taylor, by the way, is still with the Cato Institute, and he still advocates for his libertarian political views, but he does so without having to misrepresent the science. But Michaels is still running his company and still trying to discredit Hansen's prediction. In this recent Wall Street Journal op-ed, he does show scenario B, but he's come up with a new airbrushing technique for pretending the temperatures don't match it, as explained in the accompanying text. Global surface temperature has not increased significantly since 2000, discounting the larger-than-usual El Niño of 2015-16. Well, that's a novel approach to getting the answer you want, but El Niño is an integral part of the temperature pattern, as is La Niña. Shown in blue here, La Niña is a period when the oceans suck in heat from the atmosphere, and El Niño is a period when that heat is expelled. If we go to the time period in question and look at the far right of the picture, what Michaels has done is simply airbrush out the most recent El Niño in order to make atmospheric temperatures look lower than they really are. Now you see it, now you don't. Of course, the most ardent conspiracy theorists will claim that the data showing temperature rise and ice melt and glacier retreat and warming oceans are all fake, and that geologists, oceanographers, climatologists, glaciologists, journal editors and analysts of different nationalities in different countries are all in on a huge worldwide conspiracy. But even Patrick Michaels, Roy Spencer and other critics don't dispute the data. If that's what they thought, they'd simply show the evidence for that, rather than resort to all this airbrushing. So how have the predictions of the critics been doing? A few researchers thought other factors were a bigger forcing than carbon dioxide and predicted that the Earth would cool. Don Easterbrook predicted that a Pacific Ocean cycle known as the PDO would send temperatures lower, and he predicted worldwide cooling. But all three of his predictions turned out to be way under actual temperatures. They were not just wrong, they were headed in completely the wrong direction. Richard Lindzen thought cloud cover provided the Earth with a mechanism which kept the Earth's temperatures stable. Nice idea, but his prediction also turned out to be way out. Willie Soon claimed the sun drives global temperatures, but that prediction fizzled out when solar irradiance and global temperatures went in completely opposite directions. I wanted to go through the whole list, but I've already run out of time. You can debunk the rest of the list yourself simply by checking where the claim came from, whether the prediction has been accurately reported by Fox News, and whether it's based on a scientific study. So let's close, as always, by looking at what the science says. The scientific prediction that increased CO2 would cause temperature rise is now well over a century old. As far back as the 1950s, this had been quantified so accurately that the rate of warming was close to actual values. And from that, researchers could make other predictions. They predicted decades ago that increased levels of CO2 would cause the Greenland and West Antarctica ice sheets to start melting, and that prediction was correct. This graph shows the loss of Greenland ice since 2002, and now West Antarctica is also measurably losing ice. Studies predicted warmer oceans, and as we've seen, that prediction was correct. Decades ago, they predicted that global warming would lead to more evaporation and higher water vapor content in the atmosphere. Correct. Decades ago, researchers predicted that high northern latitudes would warm much faster than lower latitudes. Another correct prediction. Shrinking Arctic sea ice was predicted. Again, this prediction goes back decades, long before the ice was measurably shrinking. The only prediction that was wrong was the IPCC's estimate of how fast the ice would shrink. It's actually happening much faster. And researchers predicted that glaciers worldwide would retreat, and that's happening worldwide. A few glaciers are advancing because of local factors, but the vast majority are shrinking. And so we get into the phenomena that follow on from these changes. Of course, it's not hard to figure out that warmer oceans, which increase in volume, and melting ice, which adds more water to the oceans, both result in sea level rise. Even critics don't deny that. What they say is that we're not seeing it. Same with drought, flooding, and stronger hurricanes. We're just not seeing it. Of course, that's true if what you're expecting is that by now the Midwest should be a desert, the Arctic should be ice-free, the Great Lakes should be drying up, and New York should be underwater. We've already seen what the scientific predictions really are for the Midwest, Arctic ice, and the Great Lakes. And as for New York, James Hansen didn't predict that the city would be underwater by 2018, or Manhattan, or even parts of Manhattan for that matter. Of course, I'm going to get a lot of posts insisting that he did. So before you post, here's an idea. Do what Jerry Taylor did. Don't just repeat talking points because that's what you've read in 100 blogs, or because that's what you think you're supposed to believe. Like Jerry Taylor, go back and check your facts. In this case, check where Hansen supposedly said this and find out what he actually said. Then see if there's a scientific study that supports what he actually said. If people still believe this myth, then I'll be very happy to make a video showing how to track it back to its source. What researchers have predicted is that sea levels will rise about 3 feet this century. That's an average of about 10 millimeters a year. Sea levels are currently rising at about 3 millimeters a year, in line with predictions, and accelerating as the oceans heat up and ice melt accelerates. That may not be as dramatic as this, but the scientific conclusion is that it'll destroy coastal infrastructure, cause coastal erosion, salination, and storm surges. Some low-lying areas are already feeling that. If nothing else is done to curb the rise in CO2 emissions, the scientific prediction is for continuing sea level rise into the future. We're certainly seeing the destruction of coral reefs because of rising ocean temperatures, and that will affect fish stocks and coastal erosion. With droughts, forest fires and floods, it's much harder to detect the global warming signal among the general shifts in weather patterns, a bit like trying to detect smoking as the cause of lung cancer in a patient. But the more patients you have, the easier it is to detect a pattern. So in recent years, researchers have become more confident that the record floods, droughts and forest fires we're seeing, and record-strong hurricanes, are the result of global warming. As for reduced water supply because of glacial melt, that's another prediction that's now discernible.